In this second week of the course, we will be discussing externalities as the first source of market failure. Let me remind you first actually of what is coming up this Wednesday, namely an in-class experiment. In-class this week means, or this year means, doing it online. So there's going to be an online experiment by way of Zoom, and your attendance is expected, has consequences for your grade, and you have to make sure that you are logged in on time, because once the experiment started, you can no longer join the experiment. So I'll see you Wednesday bright and early. Last week we discussed how markets can make all of us best off by way of voluntary exchange and also by a way of changes in production. But that is only true if all that we care about is reflected in prices. And also be reminded that so far we only discussed efficiency. So we only consider how good the market outcomes are from the perspective of efficiency, whereas later on we'll also be discussing the fairness of outcomes, or equity or equality. Now, so if markets indeed function well, and if the market leads to optimal outcomes, then government intervention can only make things worse. It can only distort prices. So that's what you learned in Micro2. If you have, for example, a tax, then taxes distort prices. So as a result, there's going to be a deadweight loss. So the outcomes are then worse than in the case of no government intervention. Right? Now in Micro2 the world looks a little different. In Micro2 it is possible that government intervention can lead to better outcomes, namely when there are sources of market failure, like this week's externality. And since policies, government intervention is seldomly a period of improvement, it implies that politicians have to weigh the gains for some parties against the loss of other parties. Alright, so this week, externalities. How to define externalities? Externality is an action of an individual that affects another individual, for which the latter does not pay or is not paid. And an individual can also be a firm. So when we apply that definition to the two examples that we discussed last week, first we discussed the market for shoes, and then that entrepreneurs acting upon opportunities actually had relocated shoe production to low-wage countries, and also changed the production factors in the sense that shoe production became much more capital intensive. So basically lots of our shoes are now made in China by robots actually. But that had a consequence of this disposable shoe, and that led to more waste incineration, more air pollution. Now this air pollution was just imposed on all of us, and we were not paid for it. So that means that there is a missing market. Ideally we would have a market for clean air, and people would be happy to pay for getting clean air. So there's going to be an exchange between those causing air pollution and those dealing with the consequences, right? And similarly, in the example of productivity in the agricultural sector, with cows delivering more and more milk per year, nobody is being paid for all the negative externalities from more efficient, in a colloquial sense, milk production. For instance, water pollution, loss in animal welfare, massive habitat loss. So again, there are missing markets, and there are opportunities for training, because some people actually value nature. And they want to see a frog in a lake, and so they have a certain willingness to pay, right? So and together they could actually make a deal with, in this case, farmers to limit their pollution, and the farmer will be happy to limit the pollution because he is getting paid for doing so, right? All right, so not in all cases do externalities require government intervention, because in some cases externalities can be dealt with by the involved parties under very stringent conditions, actually. So, and we will be discussing that later on. But then there are externalities that cannot be solved by private parties, and then that is a ground for government intervention. And government intervention then may make things better. However, that, as I discussed last week, it may be that economists dream up interventions that may lead to higher efficiency, so as a consequence higher welfare, but that doesn't mean that those interventions are going to be implemented. So we will also be discussing which interventions are likely to be adopted in a democracy. The reading for this week is chapter 6 in our textbook, and that chapter deals with externalities.